An old family photo from 1905 looks completely normal, until you notice the child's hand. At first, it seems like a simple mistake, but what if that hand is moving, even today? And what happened to the men who discovered it might be even more terrifying. Watch closely, because by the end of this story, you may wish you never looked at that photograph at all. In the summer of 1987, the air in rural Pennsylvania hung heavy with heat and silence. Fields stretched endlessly under a pale sky, broken only by the occasional cluster of trees and forgotten farmhouses. One such house stood alone at the edge of a long dirt road, its paint peeling, its porch sagging, and its windows clouded with years of neglect. This was the Harper farmhouse. Daniel Reed adjusted his glasses as he stepped out of his car, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. At 29, he had already built a quiet reputation as a historian who specialized in forgotten places, abandoned homes, lost records, and stories people preferred not to remember. When the county contacted him to catalog items inside the Harper property before its sale, he accepted without hesitation. But as he stood before the house, something about it made him uneasy. It wasn't just the decay. It was the stillness. No birds perched on the roof. No insects buzzed near the broken windows. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. Daniel shook off the feeling and walked up the creaking wooden steps. The front door was already unlocked. It groaned loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a warning. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly sour. Sunlight slipped through cracks in the walls, illuminating floating particles in the air. Furniture remained where it had been left decades ago, a rocking chair in the corner, a dining table with one chair slightly pulled out, as if someone had just stood up and never returned. Daniel pulled out his notebook and began documenting the space. Every item, every detail mattered. That was his job. But as he moved deeper into the house, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he wasn't alone. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but sometimes, they seemed to creak when he wasn't moving. He paused once, listening carefully. Silence. Just the house settling, he muttered to himself. Still, he quickened his pace. After an hour of examining the ground floor, Daniel found a narrow staircase leading up to the attic. The wooden steps looked fragile, covered in a thick layer of dust. No one had been up there in years, maybe decades. He hesitated for a moment, then placed his foot on the first step. It groaned under his weight. Slowly, carefully, he climbed upward, each step echoing louder than it should have. By the time he reached the top, his heart was beating faster than he expected. The attic was darker than the rest of the house. Only a single small window allowed light inside, casting long shadows across the room. Old trunks, broken furniture, and scattered boxes filled the space. Everything was coated in dust so thick it looked like ash. Daniel coughed lightly as he stepped inside. "This is where the real history hides," he whispered. He began sorting through the items one by one. Most were ordinary, old clothes, rusted tools, faded books. But there was something strange about the way things were arranged. Some objects seemed deliberately placed, almost like someone had tried to hide certain things, or protect them. After nearly 30 minutes, Daniel noticed something unusual near the far corner of the attic. A section of the wooden floor looked slightly raised. He walked over and knelt down, brushing away the dust with his hand. His fingers traced the outline of a loose floorboard. "That's odd," he murmured. With some effort, he pried the board open. Beneath it was a small hollow space. And inside that space was a wooden box. It was simple but carefully crafted, its surface smooth despite the years. Unlike everything else in the attic, it wasn't covered in dust, as if it had been protected somehow. Daniel felt a strange chill run through him. He lifted the box out slowly and placed it on the floor. For a moment, he just stared at it. Then, with a deep breath, he opened it. Inside were several items, a bundle of old letters tied with string, a tarnished silver locket, and at the very bottom, a photograph. Daniel picked up the photograph first. It was black and white, slightly faded but still clear enough to see the details. A family stood in front of the farmhouse, the very same house he was standing in now. There were 5 of them. The father stood tall, his expression serious, almost cold. The mother stood beside him, her face pale and tired, her eyes carrying a quiet sadness. Between them were 3 children. 2 boys stood close together, both looking stiff and uncomfortable, as if they had been told not to move. And then there was the youngest child, a little girl. She stood slightly apart from the others. Her expression was different. While the rest of the family looked tense, she almost seemed calm. But not in a comforting way. There was something unnatural about her stillness. Daniel leaned closer to the photograph. At first, everything seemed normal. Just another family portrait from the early 1900s. But then his eyes moved to the girl's hands. They were folded neatly in front of her. And that's when he saw it. One of her hands looked wrong. Daniel frowned, bringing the photograph closer to his face. The hand was longer than it should have been. The fingers were thin, too thin, and strangely shaped. They didn't curve naturally like a child's hand should. Instead, they bent at odd angles, almost like joints where there shouldn't be any. He blinked, thinking it might be a trick of the light. But no matter how he looked at it, the hand remained the same. Unnatural. Probably just damage, Daniel said quietly, though his voice lacked confidence. He turned the photograph slightly, examining it from different angles. The rest of the image was perfectly intact. No tears, no distortions. Only the hand looked wrong. A faint unease settled in his chest. Then he noticed something else. The girl's hand didn't just look unusual. It looked tense. As if it were holding something. But there was nothing there. Daniel felt the temperature around him drop. A sudden draft brushed against his neck, even though the attic window was closed. He turned quickly, scanning the room. Nothing. The attic was silent. Too silent. Daniel looked back at the photograph. For a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, he thought he saw one of the fingers twitch. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, carefully, he leaned closer again. The hand was still. Exactly as before. Daniel let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah. I've been in here too long," he muttered. But he didn't put the photograph down. Instead, he stared at it a little longer than he should have. Because deep down, a thought had already taken hold. That hand didn't look damaged. It didn't look like a mistake. It looked real. And somehow, it felt like it was waiting. Daniel didn't leave the farmhouse right away. Even after the uneasy feeling in the attic, even after convincing himself the strange hand in the photograph was just an illusion, he stayed. That was his nature. Curiosity always outweighed fear. But as he packed his notes and carefully placed the photograph back into the wooden box, one thought kept circling in his mind. Who were these people, really? By the time he stepped outside, the sun was already beginning to set. The golden light made the farmhouse look almost peaceful, as if it had never held anything disturbing at all. Daniel paused at his car and glanced back at the house. For a moment, he imagined the family from the photograph standing on the porch, the father watching silently, the mother uneasy, the children perfectly still. And the little girl. He quickly looked away. That night, back in his small apartment, Daniel spread everything from the box across his desk. The letters, the locket, and the photograph sat under the soft glow of a lamp. He started with the letters. They were old and fragile, written in neat but slightly shaky handwriting. Most of them were from Eliza Harper, addressed to no one in particular, almost like a private journal she never intended to share. The first few letters were ordinary. They spoke of daily life, chores, weather, and the challenges of raising 3 children in a quiet, isolated area. But as Daniel read further, the tone began to change. The words became heavier, more uncertain, more afraid. One letter, dated early 1905, caught his attention. Thomas says I worry too much. He says children grow in strange ways, that not everything can be explained. But a mother knows when something is wrong. Clara's hand, it is not like it was before. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. So it wasn't just the photograph. Even her own mother had noticed something unusual. He continued reading. Another letter, written just weeks later, was more disturbing. I woke in the night to a sound. Soft, like scratching. I thought it was a mouse, but when I looked, Clara was sitting up in her bed. She was asleep, I am sure of it. But her hand, it was moving. Not like a dream. It moved as though it had a will of its own. Daniel felt a chill run through him. He glanced at the photograph on the table. The little girl's hand stared back at him, frozen in its unnatural shape. Sleepwalking, he whispered. It could be sleepwalking. But even as he said it, he didn't fully believe it. He picked up the next letter. The handwriting was less steady now, the ink pressed harder into the paper. I tried to hold her hand today. It felt cold. Not like a child's hand should feel. And when I let go, it did not relax. It stayed stiff, as if still holding something unseen. Daniel swallowed. That detail, the way the hand stayed tense, matched exactly what he had noticed in the photograph. He turned his attention to the silver locket. It was small and worn, with a delicate design etched into its surface. Inside was a tiny portrait of the same family, but this one was older. Clara looked younger, and in this image, her hands appeared completely normal. Daniel compared it to the photograph. Something had changed between those 2 moments in time. Something significant. Determined to learn more, Daniel visited the local library the next morning. The building was quiet, filled with the faint smell of old paper and polished wood. He approached the front desk and spoke with the librarian, an elderly man who seemed to know everything about the town's history. Harper family, the man repeated, adjusting his glasses. That name hasn't come up in years. I'm researching the old farmhouse, Daniel explained. From around 1905. The librarian's expression shifted slightly. Ah, that place, he said quietly. Strange history there. Daniel leaned forward. What kind of strange? The man hesitated, then motioned for Daniel to follow him. He led him to a back room filled with archived newspapers and records. Not everything was written down properly, the librarian said. But there were reports. He pulled out a thin folder and placed it on the table. Inside were old newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. One headline stood out immediately. Local family vanishes without trace. Daniel read quickly. The article described how the Harper family had disappeared suddenly in late 1905. Neighbors reported that the house had been quiet for days before anyone noticed something was wrong. When authorities entered, they found no signs of struggle, no bodies, no clear explanation. It was as if the family had simply ceased to exist. But there was more. Another clipping mentioned complaints from neighbors in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Strange noises. Crying late at night. And something else. One neighbor claimed to have seen movement in the windows after midnight, though the family was believed to be asleep. Shadows were described as unnatural and not matching any known figure. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He looked up at the librarian. Do you believe any of this? The old man shrugged slowly. People in small towns talk, he said. But sometimes, they don't talk enough. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? The librarian lowered his voice. There were things people didn't report. Things they were afraid to say out loud. Daniel's curiosity sharpened. Like what? The men studied him carefully before answering. Some believed the youngest child, Clara, was not entirely normal. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Because of her hand, he asked. The librarian's eyes widened slightly. You've seen it, haven't you? Daniel didn't respond. The silence was enough. The old man sighed. There were whispers, he continued. That something was wrong with that girl. Not just physically, but something deeper. People said she didn't behave like other children. Too quiet. Too still. And sometimes, she would stare at things that weren't there. Daniel thought about the photograph again. The calm expression. The unnatural stillness. What happened to them? He asked quietly. The librarian shook his head. No one knows. The case was never solved. After a while, people stopped asking questions. He paused, then added. But there was one detail, something odd. Daniel leaned in. The photograph, the librarian said. It was taken just days before they disappeared. Daniel's breath caught. That meant the image he found was one of the last records of the family. One of the last moments before everything went wrong. He returned to his apartment later that day, his mind racing. The letters. The reports. The photograph. All of it pointed to one thing. Something had been happening to Clara Harper. Something her mother feared. Something no one could explain. Daniel placed the photograph in front of him once more. His eyes went straight to the child's hand. This time, he didn't try to explain it away. Instead, he whispered. What happened to you? The room was silent. But for a brief moment, he could have sworn the air around him felt colder. And the hand in the photograph looked just a little more open than before. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The more he tried to rest, the more his mind replayed everything he had seen and read, the letters, the newspaper reports, the librarian's quiet warnings, and most of all, the photograph. It sat on his desk, untouched. But it didn't feel harmless anymore. At around 2:40 a.m., Daniel gave up trying to sleep. He turned on the lamp beside his bed and walked slowly toward the desk. The room was quiet, but not peaceful. There was a tension in the air, like something unseen was waiting. He stared at the photograph for a long moment before picking it up. The family stood frozen in time, just as before. The father, rigid. The mother, uneasy. The two boys, stiff and quiet. And Clara. Still calm. Still wrong. His eyes drifted to her hand. At first, everything looked the same. But then, Daniel frowned. The fingers. They looked slightly different. He stepped closer to the lamp, holding the photograph under stronger light. His heartbeat quickened as he focused. The fingers were not as tightly closed as before. They were looser. Just a little. Daniel's throat went dry. No, he whispered. That's not possible. He quickly reached for the scanned copy on his computer. Turning on the monitor, he pulled up the enlarged version he had saved earlier. Side by side, he compared the digital image to the physical photograph in his hand. They didn't match. In the scan, Clara's fingers were more tightly curled. In the real photograph, they were opening. Daniel stumbled back slightly, nearly dropping the picture. This isn't happening, he said under his breath. He forced himself to stay calm. There had to be a logical explanation. Lighting. Angle. Maybe even his imagination playing tricks on him after a long, stressful day. But deep down, he knew what he was seeing. And it terrified him. Determined to prove himself wrong, Daniel grabbed a magnifying lens from his drawer and sat back down. He placed the photograph flat on the desk and leaned in close. Every detail became sharper. The grain of the old paper. The faint scratches across the surface. The tiny imperfections in the image. And then, the hand. Up close, it looked even worse. The fingers were unnaturally thin, bending at angles that didn't seem possible for human joints. The skin appeared almost stretched, as if something inside was pushing outward. And there, between the fingers, Daniel froze. There was something else. A faint shadow. Not part of the original image. Not part of the background. It was layered over the hand. At first, it looked like a stain or a smudge. But as Daniel adjusted the angle of the light, the shape became clearer. It looked like another hand. Larger. Darker. Its fingers aligned almost perfectly with Clara's, but they extended slightly beyond hers, as if overlapping or guiding them. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. "What is that?" he whispered. He quickly adjusted the lamp, increasing the brightness. The shadow shifted slightly, not moving on its own, but becoming more visible. It wasn't just a shadow. It had shape. Structure. Form. The faint outline of knuckles. The suggestion of fingernails. It looked like something was gripping Clara's hand from another layer of reality. Daniel pushed himself back from the desk, breathing heavily. "This is just a double exposure," he said, louder now, as if trying to convince himself. "Old cameras, they had flaws. This is explainable." But even as he spoke, the words felt empty. Because the shadow didn't behave like a photographic error. It looked intentional. Alive. And worst of all, it looked connected. A soft tapping sound broke the silence. Daniel turned his head sharply toward the window. Tap. 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 His stomach tightened. Slowly, he stood up and walked toward the sound. The curtains were slightly open, allowing a faint view of the dark street outside. No wind. No branches nearby. Tap. The sound came again. Right against the glass. Daniel reached out and pulled the curtain back. Nothing was there. No one stood outside. No tree brushed against the window. The street was completely empty. He leaned closer, examining the glass. That's when he saw it. A faint mark. On the outside of the window. It looked like fingerprints. Long, thin fingerprints. Pressed lightly against the glass. Daniel stepped back quickly, his pulse racing. "That's not funny," he muttered, though no one else was there. He turned away from the window and looked back at his desk. The photograph was still there. But something felt different. The room felt colder. He could feel it on his skin now, a creeping chill that hadn't been there before. Slowly, almost unwillingly, Daniel walked back to the desk. His eyes locked onto the photograph. And then he stopped. His breath caught. The hand had changed again. There was no doubt this time. The fingers were more open now. Not fully extended, but no longer curled. It looked like the hand was slowly unfolding. Reaching. Daniel's mind raced. "This isn't real," he said, shaking his head. "It can't be real." But he couldn't look away. Because the more he stared, the more it felt like the hand was trying to do something. Like it was preparing. Like it was waiting for the right moment. A sudden thought hit him. He needed proof. Real proof. Not just his memory or his fear. Daniel grabbed his camera from the shelf and set it up on a tripod facing the desk. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the angle. "If this is happening," he whispered, "I need to see it." He turned on the recording function. The red light blinked softly. the camera was now watching the photograph. Watching the hand. Daniel stepped back, keeping his eyes fixed on the scene. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. The room remained silent, heavy with tension. Then, tap. Daniel flinched. The sound didn't come from the window this time. It came from behind him. Slowly, he turned around. The sound came again. Tap. 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 From the wall. From inside the room. Like fingers, tapping against wood. Daniel's chest tightened. He looked back at the photograph. And for a brief, horrifying moment, he thought he saw one of the fingers twitch. Just slightly. Just enough to break the stillness. Daniel stumbled backward, knocking into the chair behind him. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." But the camera kept recording. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere in that quiet, suffocating room, something was no longer staying still. Daniel didn't wait long the next morning. He barely reviewed the footage from the night before, just enough to confirm that something had happened, something he couldn't fully explain. The memory of the tapping, the shifting fingers, and that faint shadow overlapping Clara's hand was enough to push him forward. He needed answers. Real ones. Not guesses. Not theories. By noon, he was back on the road, driving toward a nearby town the librarian had mentioned. It was smaller than he expected, just a few quiet streets, a handful of old houses, and a general store that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. This was where Margaret lived. Daniel parked his car near the edge of the road and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Something about all of this felt wrong, like he was stepping into a story that had never truly ended. Still, he stepped out and made his way to the house. It was modest but well kept, with a small garden out front. Wind chimes hung by the porch, swaying gently, producing soft, hollow tones that echoed in the quiet air. Daniel knocked. For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stood there, her posture slightly bent, her eyes sharp despite her age. She studied Daniel carefully before speaking. "You're not from around here," she said. "No," Daniel replied politely. "My name is Daniel Reed. I'm a historian. I was told you might know something about the Harper family." The moment he said the name, her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. And something else. Fear. "You shouldn't be asking about them," she said quietly. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out the photograph. "I found this," he said, holding it out. "In their house." Margaret's eyes fell on the image. Her face went pale. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You found it." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "You know what this is?" he asked. Margaret stepped aside slowly. "Come in," she said. Inside, the house was dim but warm. The air smelled faintly of herbs and old wood. Margaret motioned for Daniel to sit at a small table, then took the photograph from his hands with trembling fingers. She stared at it like it was something alive. "You shouldn't have brought this here," she murmured. "I don't understand," Daniel said. "It's just a photograph." Margaret looked up sharply. "No," she said. "It's not." The room fell silent. Daniel leaned forward. "Please. I need to know what happened to them." Margaret hesitated, then slowly placed the photograph on the table between them. "This story," she said, "was never meant to be told outside the family." Daniel nodded. "I won't share it. I just want the truth." She studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he could handle it. Then she began. Clara Harper was not born wrong, Margaret said. At least, not at first. She was like any other child. Quiet, yes, but healthy. Daniel listened carefully. But something changed, Margaret continued. When she was around 5 years old. Daniel's mind immediately went to the letters. The timing matched. What changed? He asked. Margaret's gaze drifted slightly, as if recalling something she wished she could forget. It started with her hand, she said. Just small things at first. Her fingers seemed longer than before. They moved differently. Her mother noticed it before anyone else. Daniel nodded. Eliza wrote about it. Margaret's eyes flickered with recognition. You've read the letters? Yes. Then you know she was afraid, Margaret said softly. Daniel didn't respond. Because he knew. But Eliza didn't understand what she was dealing with, Margaret continued. None of them did. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. There was something attached to Clara. Daniel's chest tightened. Attached, he repeated. Margaret nodded slowly. Not inside her, she said. Not like an illness. It was, outside. But connected. Daniel's mind flashed to the shadowy hand in the photograph. The hand, he said quietly. Yes, Margaret whispered. That hand was not entirely hers. A heavy silence filled the room. Daniel struggled to process what he was hearing. That doesn't make sense, he said. How could something? It doesn't need to make sense, Margaret interrupted. It just needs to exist. Daniel fell silent. Margaret continued. My grandmother used to tell me about it. She was a child back then. She lived nearby. She said people began to notice things. What kind of things? Daniel asked. Clara would stare at empty corners of rooms, Margaret said. Like she was watching someone no one else could see. Sometimes she would move her hand, as if she was following instructions. Daniel felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. And at night, Margaret added, there were sounds. The neighbors heard them, Daniel said. Margaret nodded. Scratching. Tapping. Whispering, she said. Not from outside the house, but from within the walls. Daniel's thoughts raced. What about Thomas? He asked. The father. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. He refused to believe anything was wrong, she said. He thought it was all imagination. Fear. He tried to ignore it. And Eliza. She knew, Margaret said firmly. A mother always knows. Margaret reached out and gently touched the photograph. She tried to protect her children, she said. But it was already too late. Daniel leaned forward. What do you mean? Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with quiet dread. It wasn't just watching Clara, she said. It was learning. Daniel felt his breath catch. Learning, he repeated. Margaret nodded slowly. Through her hand, she said. It was learning how to move, how to touch, how to exist here. Daniel's mind struggled to keep up. And then, he asked. Margaret's voice dropped to almost nothing. Then it grew stronger. The room seemed colder now. Stronger how? Daniel asked. Margaret hesitated. Then she said. One night, the shadows inside the house began to move. Daniel froze. Not like normal shadows, she continued. They didn't follow the light. They moved on their own. Daniel remembered the newspaper clipping. The neighbor's report. People saw them through the windows, Margaret said. Shapes, shifting, stretching. Her hand trembled slightly as she pointed at the photograph. And that picture, she said, was taken just days before everything ended. Daniel swallowed. "What happened that night?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but filled with something deeper than fear. "They didn't leave the house," she said. Daniel's stomach dropped. "They were taken from it." "By what?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. Margaret's eyes slowly moved back to Clara's hand in the photograph. "That," she said. Silence filled the room. Daniel stared at the image. At the unnatural fingers. At the faint shadow overlapping them. And for the first time, he truly understood. This wasn't just a photograph. It was evidence. Of something that had been reaching into their world. Long before anyone noticed. Margaret suddenly reached out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "If that thing is still attached to the photograph," she said urgently, "you need to get rid of it." Daniel blinked. "Get rid of it?" "Burn it," she said. "Destroy it. Whatever you have to do." Daniel hesitated. "But if it's the only proof?" "Proof won't matter if it finds you," Margaret snapped. The room fell silent again. Daniel slowly pulled his hand back. He looked down at the photograph one more time. At Clara. At her hand. And for a brief moment, he thought he saw the faint shadow shift. Just slightly. Like it was listening. Waiting. And perhaps understanding every word they had just said. Daniel didn't follow Margaret's advice. Not completely. He told himself he would. On the drive back, he even repeated it out loud. "I'll destroy it. I'll burn it tonight." But every time he pictured the photograph turning to ash, something inside him resisted. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like obligation. If what Margaret said was true, if something had used Clara's hand to learn, to grow, then the photograph wasn't just evidence. It was a doorway. And Daniel couldn't bring himself to close it without understanding what was on the other side. By the time he reached his apartment, the sky had already darkened. The streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. Everything felt normal on the outside. But inside, Daniel knew something had changed. He locked the door behind him. Checked the windows. Then placed the photograph carefully on his desk. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at it. "You're not real," he whispered. The image didn't respond. The family stood as they always had. Still. Silent. But Clara's hand. It was no longer half-curled. Now, it was almost fully open. The fingers stretched outward, thin and unnatural, as if reaching for something beyond the frame. Daniel swallowed hard. "Okay," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "No more guessing." He moved quickly, setting up his camera again, this time more carefully. He adjusted the angle so the photograph filled the center of the frame. Then he added a second light source, brighter than before, ensuring every detail would be visible. If something happened tonight, he would catch it. Every second of it. The red recording light blinked on. Daniel stepped back. The room fell quiet. Too quiet. He glanced at the clock. 2:58 a.m. His chest tightened. He didn't know why, but he had a strong feeling that time mattered. He didn't sit. Didn't blink more than necessary. He just watched. The seconds ticked by slowly. 3:05 a.m. Nothing. 3:11 a.m. Still nothing. But the air in the room felt heavier now. Colder. Daniel rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the chill. Then. 3:17 a.m. The moment the clock changed, something shifted. It was subtle. So subtle that if he had blinked, he might have missed it. The photograph didn't move. But the image inside it did. Clara's fingers twitched. Daniel's breath caught. He leaned forward slightly, eyes wide. "No way," he whispered. The movement was slow. Almost careful. Like something testing its control. One finger lifted slightly higher than the others. Then another. The hand was no longer frozen. It was moving. Actually moving. Daniel's legs felt weak, but he didn't step back. He couldn't. Because now something else was happening. The shadow. That faint, overlapping shape he had seen before. It was becoming clearer. Darker. Thicker. It no longer looked like a stain or a trick of light. It looked solid. And it was growing. The outline of a second hand, larger, longer, began to separate itself from Clara's. Daniel felt his heart slam against his chest. "That's not possible," he said, his voice shaking. But it was happening. Right in front of him. The shadow hand slowly pulled away from the photograph's surface, like something pressing from behind a thin layer of glass. The paper itself didn't tear. Didn't bend. But the image stretched. As if it were no longer flat. As if it had depth. Daniel took a step back. The air around him felt wrong now. Thick. Heavy. Like breathing through water. The fingers of the shadow hand extended further, pushing outward. Reaching. Searching. And then. The camera flickered. The light dimmed for just a second. But that second was enough. Because when the light returned, the hand was closer. Not just closer in the photograph. Closer to him. Daniel stumbled backward, knocking into the wall. "No," he said, louder now. "No, stop." Tap. The sound echoed through the room. Daniel froze. Tap. It came again. From the desk. From the photograph. Like fingers, tapping against the inside of the image. Trying to get out. Daniel's mind raced. "Burn it." Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "Destroy it." He lunged toward the desk, grabbing the photograph with shaking hands. The moment his fingers touched it, something moved. Fast. The shadow hand jerked. And for the briefest second, Daniel felt something touch him. Not physically. Not like skin. But something cold. Sharp. Like a presence brushing against his hand. He screamed and dropped the photograph. It hit the floor face up. The image staring back at him. But now, something was wrong. Very wrong. Daniel's breathing became shallow. His eyes locked onto the photograph. The family was still there. The father. The mother. The two boys. But Clara. Clara was gone. Her place in the image was empty. A blank space where she once stood. Daniel's chest tightened. "No," he whispered. Then. He saw it. Standing beside the family. Was someone else. A man. His posture stiff. His face pale. His expression frozen in pure terror. Daniel's stomach dropped. Because he recognized that face. His own. The photograph slipped from his trembling hands. "No, no, no, this isn't real." Tap. The sound came again. Behind him. Daniel turned slowly. His heart pounded louder than anything else. The room felt smaller. Darker. And colder than ever before. He looked down at his right hand. His breath stopped. His fingers. They looked wrong. Longer. Thinner. And slightly bent. Just like Clara's. Daniel tried to move them. They responded. But not completely. Like something else was guiding them. Controlling them. "No," he whispered, backing away. "No, get off." The lights flickered. The camera fell silent. And the room went dark. Weeks later, Daniel Reed was reported missing. No signs of struggle. No explanation. Just an empty apartment. When the landlord finally entered, everything looked untouched. Except for one thing. The photograph. It lay on the floor. Waiting. The Harper family stood together once again. Complete. Unmoving. But if you looked closely, you might notice something strange. The man standing beside them. His hand didn't look quite right. The fingers were too long. Too thin. And slightly open. As if reaching. Or waiting. And sometimes, very rarely, people say they can see it move.